Dad, where's Mom? Hazel's voice tugged me from the small group of guests I was chatting with. Her delicate fingers wrapped around my sleeve, pulling me slightly away from the conversation. She's probably with Blake, making sure everything is perfect for your sister, I replied, keeping my tone light. I forced a smile for her benefit, but Hazel wasn't buying it. She wrinkled her nose. Blake again? She's been spending a lot of time with him lately. Kinda weird, don't you think? I chuckled nervously, brushing her concern aside. He's our lawyer's sweetheart. He's probably just helping with the contract for the venue or something. Hazel rolled her eyes. Still weird, she muttered before wandering off to join her friends. I stood there for a moment, watching her go, her words bouncing around in my head. Blake was a fixture in our lives, and that was normal, wasn't it? He'd handled our family's legal matters for years, helped us navigate tricky situations, and had always been someone we could rely on. Yet recently his presence felt more constant, more ingrained. Pushing the thought away, I turned back to the crowd. The engagement party was in full swing, the sounds of clinking glasses and cheerful laughter filling the air. The garden lights cast a warm glow over the carefully arranged tables, and Kayla, my eldest, was radiant in her white engagement dress. Dad! Kayla called out as she made her way over, her fiancé, Jason, trailing behind her. Hey, sweetheart, I said, straightening as she approached. Stop hovering, she teased, placing a hand on my arm. It's my night, not yours. Go mingle or something. Mom's got everything under control. Just relax for once, okay? Jason laughed. Your dad's a perfectionist, Kayla. Let him breathe. I smiled and nodded, raising my glass in mock surrender. All right. I'll stay out of your hair. They laughed before heading off toward the main table, their arms linked. I watched them for a moment, my chest swelling with pride. Despite everything, I couldn't deny how happy Kayla looked tonight. Still, Hazel's words lingered. I made my rounds, greeting guests, shaking hands, and making small talk. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but a nagging unease clawed at the back of my mind. Where was Grace? My wife had always been the social butterfly of the family, the one who effortlessly floated between conversations, lighting up any room she entered. Yet tonight, I hadn't seen her since the party started. Eventually, I spotted a familiar face. Blake! I called out, weaving through the crowd to reach him. He was standing near the bar, chatting with a few guests, his tailored suit immaculate as always. He turned at the sound of my voice, a wide grin spreading across his face. Daniel, there you are. Fantastic party, my friend. Thanks, I said, clasping his hand firmly. Have you seen Grace? Hazel said she's been with you most of the evening. Blake's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. She was just checking on a few things in the garden, he said smoothly. You know how she is, always making sure everything's perfect. I nodded slowly, though the tightness in my chest remained. Right? Well, enjoy yourself. He raised his glass in a mock toast. You too. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Blake's answer had been too quick, too polished. Deciding to follow my gut, I slipped away from the main party, heading toward the garden. The path was lined with flickering lanterns, their soft glow casting shadows across the manicured hedges. The sound of laughter and music faded behind me as I moved deeper into the property. The laughter from the party became a faint hum as I stepped into the garden. The cool air brushed against my skin, a brief relief from the warmth of the crowded celebration. I wasn't even sure why I'd come out here, maybe to clear my head. Hazel's words from earlier kept replaying in my mind. She's been spending a lot of time with him lately. It wasn't the first time the thought had crossed my mind, but I always pushed it aside. Blake had been our family lawyer for over a decade, practically a fixture at every major milestone. He was a professional, someone I trusted, someone Grace trusted. Still, the unease lingered. Grace? I called out, my voice breaking the quiet. No answer. I rounded the corner near the fountain, my footsteps slowing as I spotted two figures standing beneath the sprawling oak tree. At first, I thought they were just two guests seeking a quiet moment away from the crowd. But as I stepped closer, my heart plummeted. As I rounded the corner near the old oak tree, I stopped in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. There, In the faint glow of the garden lanterns was Grace. Her hands gripped the lapels of Blake's suit as she kissed him, her lips moving against his with a passion I hadn't seen in years. His arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer. My stomach churned. For a moment, I couldn't move. The surreal nature of the scene held me captive, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The silver glint of her wedding ring caught the light, mocking me. Finally, I found my voice. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, louder than I intended. They broke apart instantly, but neither looked particularly panicked. Grace turned toward me, her expression oddly calm. If anything, she looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something trivial. "Oh, you're here?" she said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Her tone was casual, her smirk cold. "Perfect timing." "Perfect timing?" I repeated, incredulous. My fists clenched at my sides. "You're out here kissing him at our daughter's engagement party, and that's all you have to say?" Blake stepped forward, straightening his tie like he was at a business meeting. "Look, Daniel, let's not make this into a scene." "A scene?" I barked, cutting him off. "You're sleeping with my wife at my event, and you're worried about a scene?" Grace sighed, crossing her arms as if bored with the whole thing. "Daniel, calm down. There's no point in overreacting." "Overreacting?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "You're cheating on me with my lawyer. How long has this been going on?" She shrugged, her smirk returning. "Does it matter? What's done is done. What's done is done." I repeated, my voice rising. "You've betrayed me, Grace." "How could you?" Before I could finish, she cut me off. "Oh, spare me the theatrics, Daniel. You should know the truth by now." She took a step closer, her voice dripping with venom. "Blake and I have been revising your assets and legal documents for years. Everything, your money, your properties, your business, has been transferred to accounts in our names. You've officially been erased." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. My heart pounded in my chest as the implications sank in. "Well, what are you talking about?" Blake cleared his throat, his smug confidence now grating on me. "It's all legal, Daniel. You sign off on everything. Granted, you might not have realized it at the time, but the paperwork was all in order. You forged my signature." I snarled, taking a step toward him. Blake held up his hands defensively. "Easy now. No need to get violent." "Violent?" I growled. "You haven't even seen Violent yet." Before I could do anything, the sound of footsteps on gravel drew all of our attention. I turned to see Kayla and Hazel approaching, their faces lit with curiosity and irritation. "Dad, what's going on?" Kayla asked, her eyes darting between the three of us. "What's going on?" I snapped, pointing at Grace and Blake. "Your mother is having an affair with him." Kayla's eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from surprise to disdain. "Seriously, Dad? You're making a scene at my engagement party?" "I'm making a scene?" I said, my voice rising. "Your mother is cheating on me with Blake, and I'm the problem?" Hazel crossed her arms, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Oh, come on, Dad. Don't act so shocked. Blake's been more of a father to us than you ever were." Her words felt like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "At least Blake knows how to take care of a family," she shot back. "Unlike you, always busy with work, never around." I turned to Kayla, hoping for some semblance of support. "You're okay with this? With what your mother is doing?" Kayla shrugged, her expression cold. "Honestly, maybe if you'd been a better husband, Mom wouldn't have needed someone else." My stomach sank as I looked at my daughters, their words cutting deeper than any betrayal from Grace. "You're both siding with them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're just telling the truth," Grace said, stepping beside Blake. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her smirk never wavering. "Face it, Daniel. You're obsolete. You've been replaced." Blake grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Don't worry, kids. I'll take care of everything from now on." The smugness on his face, the betrayal in Grace's eyes, the disdain for my own children. It was too much. My fists clenched at my sides as I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and Blake. "You think you can take my family, my life, my fortune, and just walk away?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. Blake didn't flinch. "I don't think, Daniel. I know. It's already done. Grace laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent a chill down my spine. Daniel, darling, we already have. Her words echoed in my ears as I stood there, frozen in place. My world had just crumbled before my eyes, and the people I loved most had been the ones holding the hammer. The party ended in chaos. I didn't wait for the guests to leave or for the questions that would inevitably follow. I walked straight to my home office, locked the door behind me, and sank into my chair. My hands trembled as I picked up the stack of papers Grace had so brazenly left on my desk. At first glance, it seemed like standard paperwork, things I had signed in trust over the years. But as I flipped through the pages, the truth unraveled like a nightmare. Blake, the man I had trusted for years, had orchestrated a slow, deliberate theft. My properties, my savings, even the shares of my company, bit by bit, it had all been transferred into joint accounts under Grace's name. Their arrogance was evident in the sloppiness of their plan. Some of my signatures didn't even resemble my own handwriting. Blake had forged documents, confident I wouldn't notice. I clenched my fists, the papers crumpling under my grip. Grace and Blake had taken everything, assuming I'd roll over and accept defeat. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't going to let them win. The next morning, I woke up with renewed determination. My first call was to an old friend, Maverick, a senior investigator with the Bar Association. Maverick and I had known each other for years, and if anyone could help expose Blake's corruption, it was him. Daniel, Maverick said, his tone surprised but warm. It's been a while. What's going on? I need your help, I said, wasting no time. Blake Harrington, my lawyer, he's committed serious ethical violations. He's forged my signature on legal documents, stolen assets, and likely committed fraud. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's a heavy accusation, Maverick said carefully. You have evidence? Plenty, I replied. I'll send you everything I've got. All right, Maverick said, his tone firm. I'll start an investigation immediately. If what you're saying checks out, Blake won't just lose his license, he could face criminal charges. I hung up, feeling the first flicker of satisfaction. Blake's career was about to crumble, and I would make sure he went down hard. Next, I turned my attention to my finances. My hands were steady now as I dialed the number of a forensic accountant I had worked with during a business acquisition years ago. Daniel, it's been a while, said Karen, her voice calm and professional. I need your expertise, I said. It's urgent. I'm dealing with fraud, assets stolen under my nose. Can you help me trace the transfers? Karen didn't hesitate. Send me everything you have. I'll start immediately. By the afternoon, Karen had called me back. You were right, Daniel, she said. The transfers are blatant, and the forgery is amateur at best. I've already flagged several accounts linked to Grace and Blake. With this evidence, you can file a lawsuit and freeze their assets. Let's do it, I said. Within hours, court orders were drafted. By the next day, Grace and Blake were served. Their bank accounts were frozen, their access to the stolen funds severed. The following evening, I was in my office when my phone buzzed. It was a call from Grace. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up. What do you want? I asked coldly. What the hell have you done, Daniel? She snapped, her voice dripping with anger. Our accounts are frozen. We can't access anything. I smirked, though she couldn't see it. Oh, that? I just took back what's mine. This is illegal, she shouted. You can't just freeze our accounts. You mean the accounts you and Blake stole from me? I shot back. Everything you've done has been documented and reported. Blake's under investigation by the Bar Association, and soon the police will come knocking. There was a brief silence on her end, and then she hissed, You're a bastard, Daniel. No, Grace, I said, my voice icy. I'm just finally standing up for myself. You made this mess, and now you'll deal with the consequences. I hung up before she could respond. A few days later, I received a call from Maverick. Daniel, he said, Blake's license has been suspended pending a full investigation. The evidence you provided was damning. He's in serious trouble. Hearing those words was like a weight lifting off my chest. Thank you, Maverick. I can't tell you how much this means to me. Don't thank me yet, Maverick said. There's still a long road ahead. But with what we have, Blake's career is as good as over. I hung up, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. Blake's smug grin from that night replayed in my mind, but now it felt hollow. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. The next step was confronting my daughters. Kayla and Hazel had made their loyalties clear at the party, but I couldn't let their betrayal go unchecked. I called them into the living room one evening, my tone firm but calm. "What's this about?" Kayla asked, her arms crossed as she sat on the couch. Hazel slouched beside her, looking equally irritated. "I want to talk about the party," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About what you said, about how you defended your mother and Blake." "Seriously, Dad?" Hazel groaned. "We already told you." "I don't want excuses," I interrupted. "I want you to understand what you've done." Kayla rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go? The victim's speech?" "No," I said, my tone sharper. "This is about consequences. Your mother and Blake stole everything from me. They betrayed me, and you stood by them. They were just trying to protect us," Hazel argued. "Protect you?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea what they've done? They forged documents, stole my assets, and lied to all of us. That's not protection. That's manipulation." Kayla's confidence faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Maybe if you weren't such a control freak, none of this would have happened." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You're both old enough to understand right from wrong. You chose to side with them. That's your choice, but don't expect me to forgive it so easily." Hazel looked away, her expression unreadable. Kayla, however, stood up, her eyes blazing. "You know what, Dad? Maybe you deserve this. You've always put your work before us. Don't act like you're some innocent victim." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. "If that's how you feel, fine. But don't come running to me when the truth about your mother and Blake catches up with you." Kayla stormed out, and Hazel followed silently. As the door slammed shut behind them, I sat back, exhaling deeply. Grace and Blake thought they had destroyed me. My daughters thought I was weak. They were all wrong. The counterstrike had just begun. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. Grace sat across from me, dressed in a sleek suit, her head held high like she was walking into a boardroom rather than a legal hearing. Beside her sat Blake, his usual smug confidence replaced with a forced calm. His disbarment had hit the news just days ago, and it was clear the weight of the investigation was grinding him down. My daughters, Kayla and Hazel, sat behind them, glaring at me with open disdain. The judge banged her gavel. "This court is now in session." I sat still, my lawyer presenting the mountain of evidence against Grace and Blake. Document after document was displayed on the screen, proof of forged signatures, illegal transfers, and fraudulent filings. I didn't watch the screen. Instead, I focused on their reactions. Grace's calm facade cracked as each piece of evidence stacked against her. Her lips tightened, and she began whispering furiously to Blake. He, in turn, looked paler with each passing moment. Finally, Grace snapped. "This is ridiculous," she barked, standing abruptly. The judge shot her a stern look. "Mrs. Hart, sit down." Grace hesitated but obeyed, her face flushed with anger. She threw a venomous glare my way, her voice low but audible enough. "You think you've won, Daniel?" I didn't respond, keeping my focus straight ahead. As the court recessed for lunch, Grace made her way toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped inches from me, her expression twisted with fury. "You're nothing without me. Without us." I stood, meeting her glare with a calm, steady gaze. "You betrayed me," I said quietly, "and you've poisoned our children against me. But I'm not going to let you take everything I've worked for." Behind her, Kayla and Hazel approached, their faces dark with anger. "Dad, why are you doing this?" Hazel snapped. "Why are you trying to destroy Mom?" "Destroy her?" I repeated, my voice calm but firm. "She destroyed this family the moment she decided to betray me." "Stop acting like the victim," Kayla hissed. "Maybe if you weren't so cold, Mom wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." "That's enough," I said sharply, my patience thinning. "You're both adults now. You can believe whatever lies your mother has told you, but I won't stand here and let you rewrite history." Blake sauntered over, his face a mixture of frustration and defiance. Daniel, you're making a mistake. This won't end well for you. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only he could hear. It already has for you. Later that day, as the proceedings continued, the tide began to turn in my favor. The forensic accountant I had hired testified, breaking down each fraudulent transfer in excruciating detail. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence suffocating. Grace fidgeted in her seat, her earlier confidence now replaced by visible unease. Blake, seated beside her, avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. When the judge asked Grace if she had anything to say in her defense, she hesitated. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "Everything I did was for my family. Daniel was never around. He prioritized his work over us. I needed someone who cared. I couldn't stay silent any longer. And you thought stealing from me and forging my signature was the answer?" I shot back, my voice cutting through the courtroom. The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Hart, you'll have your turn to speak." Grace shot me a withering look, but said nothing further. After the hearing adjourned for the day, I found myself alone in the hallway, staring out the window. The weight of everything pressed down on me, the betrayal, the lies, the fractured relationship with my daughters. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Hazel approaching, her expression conflicted. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded, motioning to a bench nearby. She sat down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't get it, Dad. Why are you fighting so hard? Why not just let it go?" I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Hazel, this isn't just about money or assets. It's about trust. Your mother and Blake didn't just betray me. They broke the law. If I let this go, what kind of message does that send?" She looked down, avoiding my gaze. "Mom said you were never there for us, that you cared more about your work than our family." Her words stung, but I kept my composure. "I know I wasn't perfect," I admitted. "I made mistakes. But everything I did, every late night, every business trip, was for you and Kayla. To give you a life where you never had to worry about anything." Hazel's shoulders sagged slightly, the tension in her posture easing. I don't know who to believe anymore." "Believe the facts," I said gently. "Look at what your mother and Blake have done. Look at how they've manipulated you and Kayla. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to see the truth." She didn't respond, but the conflict in her eyes told me my words had reached her. The next morning, as the final day of hearings began, I noticed a shift in the courtroom. Kayla and Hazel still sat behind Grace, but Hazel avoided my gaze, her expression thoughtful. Blake's lawyer tried one last desperate attempt to discredit the evidence, but it was clear the case was slipping through their fingers. The judge announced that her ruling would be delivered in a week, and the session was adjourned. As I left the courtroom, Grace caught up to me in the hallway. Her voice was low, almost pleading. "Daniel, we don't have to do this. We can settle, walk away, and I'll make sure the girls stay in your life." I stopped, turning to face her. "You don't get to bargain with me, Grace. Not anymore. The damage is done, and I'm not walking away from this." Her face twisted in anger. "You're going to regret this. You're going to lose everything, your family, your daughters. Then that's on you," I said, cutting her off. "You made your choices. Now live with them." I walked away without looking back, leaving Grace standing there, her threats ringing hollow. The fallout wasn't over, but for the first time in years, I felt like I had regained control of my life. Whatever came next, I was ready. The storm outside raged as the rain lashed against the windows. I was in the living room, sipping a glass of whiskey, relishing the silence that had replaced the chaos of the last few weeks. The court had ruled decisively in my favor earlier that day. My assets were restored, Blake's career was in ruins, and Grace was left with nothing but a pile of legal fees and shattered pride. I didn't expect a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then came louder, more urgent. I set my glass down and walked toward the door, glancing at the clock. It was past 10 p.m., whoever it was. I wasn't in the mood for visitors. When I opened the door, I froze. Grace stood there, drenched from head to toe. Her once perfectly styled hair clung to her face, and her makeup was smeared from either the rain or tears, or both. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to stay warm. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please, can we talk?" I stared at her, my grip tightening on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face. The other part, perhaps the one clinging to the man I used to be, wanted to hear what she had to say. I stepped aside wordlessly, letting her in. She stood in the foyer, dripping onto the hardwood floor, her eyes scanning the house, as if it was unfamiliar to her now. I handed her a towel and motioned toward the living room. She followed, hesitating before sitting on the edge of the couch. "Why are you here, Grace?" I asked, standing across from her with my arms crossed. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. I don't know where else to go," she admitted. "Everything's gone, Daniel. The accounts, the house, Blake, it's all gone." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "And whose fault is that?" She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we've been through so much together. Can't we try to fix this?" Her words hit me like a hammer. "Fix this? After everything she'd done? You want me to fix this?" I said, my voice rising. "You forged my signature, stole from me, humiliated me in front of our children, and you want me to just forgive and forget?" Tears streamed down her face now. "I wasn't thinking, Daniel. I was angry. I felt alone. Don't," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. I was there for you, for our family. I worked myself to the bone to give you and the kids a life most people could only dream of. And how did you repay me? By stabbing me in the back." She sobbed openly now, burying her face in her hands. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you, Daniel. Please. I've lost everything. I don't want to lose you too." I stared at her, 1,000 memories flooding my mind. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, the countless moments we'd shared. But every fond memory was now tainted by the image of her and Blake under that oak tree. "You didn't just lose me, Grace," I said coldly. "You threw me away." She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What about the kids? Don't you care what this is doing to them?" That struck a nerve, and I felt my jaw tighten. "You mean the kids who called Blake their real dad? The ones who sneered at me like I was some kind of villain? Don't pretend this is about them, Grace. You turned them against me long before I ever fought back." She shook her head furiously. "They were just angry, Daniel. They didn't mean it. They love you, I know they do." I let out a bitter chuckle. "Love me? They haven't even tried to contact me since this all started. Do you know how many messages I've sent them? How many times I've reached out, only to be ignored?" Grace looked down, guilt flashing across her face. "I told them not to talk to you," she admitted quietly. I stared at her, stunned. "You what?" "I thought it would make things easier," she said quickly. "I thought if they stayed on my side, you'd give up the fight." I shook my head, disbelief coursing through me. "Unbelievable. You used our children as pawns in your sick little game." She reached out, her hand trembling. "Daniel, please. I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll talk to the girls. I took a step back, her hand falling limply to her side. "It's too late for that, Grace. You've burned every bridge there is to burn." For a moment, the only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. Grace sat there, defeated, her sobs filling the silence. "I loved you," I said finally, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I loved you with everything I had. But the person sitting in front of me isn't the woman I married. That woman would never have done what you did." Her sobs grew louder, and she covered her face again. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. "I don't even know why I did it." I looked at her, feeling a pang of something, pity, maybe, but I quickly shoved it aside. "You made your choices, Grace," I said, my tone hardening again. "Now you have to live with them." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Is there nothing I can do to fix this?" "Nothing at all." I shook my head. "No, Grace. This isn't something you can fix with an apology. You made your bed. Now lie in it." I walked to the door, opening it wide. The storm outside was as fierce as ever. You should go, I said, not unkindly. She stood slowly, wrapping the towel tighter around herself. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else, but then she nodded and walked past me into the rain. I watched her disappear into the night, the door closing behind her with a finality that felt like the end of an era. As I returned to the living room, I picked up my glass of whiskey and stared into it. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, not happiness, not yet, but peace. Grace had begged for mercy, but there was none left to give. Months passed. The storm Grace had brought into my life was gone, leaving behind a strange calm. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling suffocated. My days became quieter but fuller, spent rebuilding my life, both professionally and personally. I had thrown myself back into my business, pouring hours into projects I had once neglected. It wasn't just about work. It was about reclaiming my sense of purpose. The company I had built from the ground up became a reminder of what I was capable of, even when my personal life had been reduced to ashes. But there was more to life than work. Slowly, I started reconnecting with old friends. People I hadn't spoken to in years came back into my life, offering support and occasionally a much-needed reality check. One of those friends, Mark, had been trying to drag me out for weeks. "You can't keep hiding behind your office desk," he said one afternoon over lunch. "You got to get out there, Daniel. You've spent enough time licking your wounds." I laughed bitterly. "You make it sound like I'm avoiding life." "I'm just busy." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, busy avoiding anything that involves fun. You need to move on. Grace isn't the last woman on earth, you know." It was a comment I brushed off at the time, but it stuck with me. Moving on had always seemed impossible, a distant dream, clouded by betrayal and bitterness. Yet, as the months wore on, I found myself wondering, what if he was right? It wasn't long after that conversation that I met Amina. The first time I saw her was at a local bookstore. I had stopped by to pick up a novel recommended by Mark, a motivational book I wasn't particularly interested in, but I thought I'd humor him. She was sitting at a small table near the cafe, engrossed in a thick hardcover. I caught myself staring. She had an air of quiet confidence, her curly auburn hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her face was expressive, her lips twitching into a smile as she turned the page. I hesitated. The old me would have walked away, unwilling to risk an awkward interaction. But something about her drew me in. Before I knew it, I was walking toward her. "Good book?" I asked, surprising even myself. She looked up, startled but not annoyed. Her hazel eyes met mine, and she smiled warmly. "That depends. Do you like murder mysteries?" I chuckled. "Only if they're not too predictable." "Then you'd probably hate this one," she said, closing the book with a mock sigh. "I've already figured out the killer, and I'm only halfway through." Her lightheartedness was disarming. I gestured to the seat across from her. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure. I'm Amina, by the way." "Daniel." Our conversation flowed effortlessly. She told me about her work as a freelance editor and her love for traveling. I shared a bit about my business, careful not to delve too deeply into my personal life. It was refreshing to talk to someone who didn't know my history, who saw me as just another person, not a man defined by his past. After an hour, I realized how much I had enjoyed our time together. As I stood to leave, I hesitated. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime? Or dinner?" She smiled, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Are you asking me out, Daniel?" I nodded, feeling oddly nervous. "Yes, I am." Her smile widened. "Then yes, I'd love to." Our first date was simple, dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant. Amina was easy to talk to, her curiosity and humor pulling me out of my shell in ways I hadn't expected. "Okay," she said, leaning forward with a mischievous grin. "Tell me something most people don't know about you." I laughed, shaking my head. "That's a dangerous question." "Come on," she teased. "I promise I won't judge." I thought for a moment, then said, "I'm terrible at karaoke. Like, embarrassingly bad." She burst out laughing. "That's it? That's your big confession?" "You've clearly never heard me sing," I said, grinning. She tilted her head, studying me. "Your turn. Ask me something." "All right," I said, leaning back. "What's the one place you've always wanted to visit?" Her eyes lit up. Japan. I've always been fascinated by the culture, the food, the history, everything. What about you? Greece, I admitted. The history, the architecture. And I hear the food's not bad either. She smiled. Maybe we should make a deal. I'll go to Greece with you if you go to Japan with me. I laughed. I'll hold you to that. As weeks turned into months, my relationship with Amina deepened. She had a way of making me feel seen, understood, and valued. Not as the man who had been betrayed, but as someone worth loving for who I was. One evening, as we walked through the park, I found myself opening up about Grace. It wasn't something I had planned. The words just spilled out. She hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible. I admitted, my voice heavy. It's hard to let go of that kind of betrayal. Amina stopped walking, turning to face me. I can't imagine how hard that must have been, she said softly. But you're here now, Daniel. You survived it, and you deserve to be happy. Her words struck a chord deep within me. I realized she was right. Grace's betrayal no longer defined me. It was part of my story, yes, but it wasn't the end. One night, over dinner, I looked at Amina and realized just how much my life had changed since the day I saw Grace and Blake in the garden. Thank you, I said suddenly. She raised an eyebrow, puzzled. For what? For reminding me that life can be good again, I said simply. Her expression softened, and she reached across the table to take my hand. You didn't need me for that, Daniel. You did it yourself. I'm just lucky to be part of it. In that moment, I knew I had found something real, something worth holding on to. My past with Grace was still a wound, but it was no longer bleeding. With Amina by my side, I had found a new beginning. And for the first time in years, I was truly looking forward to the future. Grace's downfall began with whispers and glances. What had once been smug confidence now gave way to humiliation as the community slowly turned its back on her and Blake. Their perfect facade shattered the moment the court rulings went public. News spread fast in our circle. How Blake had been disbarred for fraud, how Grace had conspired with him to rob me blind, and how they both lost everything in their greed. I heard about their struggles through mutual acquaintances. Grace was trying to sell off what little personal belongings she had left, designer bags, jewelry, even her car, to pay the legal fees piling up. But her once loyal friends weren't lining up to help. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from an old family friend, Karen. Daniel, you'll never believe who I ran into at the grocery store, she said, her tone equal parts amused and pitying. Let me guess, I said, already knowing the answer. Grace, Karen replied. She looked rough. I didn't even recognize her at first. She tried to pretend everything was fine, but I could tell she was barely holding it together. It's sad, really. I thanked Karen for the call and hung up, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Grace and Blake's misery didn't bring me joy, but it felt like justice. Meanwhile, Blake wasn't faring any better. Without his law license, he was forced to take a job at a car dealership, hardly the high-profile career he'd once boasted about. His arrogance made it nearly impossible for him to hold on to clients or even get along with coworkers. A mutual friend, Maverick, filled me in on Blake's downfall during a chance encounter at a coffee shop. He's desperate, Daniel, Maverick said, shaking his head. I ran into him last week, and he tried to borrow money from me. Can you believe that? The guy who used to flaunt his success like he was untouchable is now begging people for loans. I sipped my coffee, listening without much reaction. Sounds about right. Doesn't it feel good? Maverick asked, leaning in with a grin. I shook my head. No, it doesn't. But it feels fair. Grace eventually reached out to me, though not directly. I received an email one morning, a long, rambling message that was equal parts apology and self-justification. Daniel, I know I hurt you, but I was lost. I made mistakes, and I see that now. Blake wasn't who I thought he was, and I can't believe I let him ruin everything. I miss what we had. Please, let's talk. I want to fix things, not just for us, but for the girls. We were a family once. Can't we be again? I stared at the email for a long time before closing my laptop without replying. Grace wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. My daughters, Kayla and Hazel, had been slower to feel the weight of Grace and Blake's actions, but it eventually caught up to them. They had sided with their mother, blinded by her lies and manipulations. But once the truth came out, their resentment shifted. It started with small gestures, texts asking how I was doing, casual attempts to reconnect. "Dad, can we meet for lunch?" Hazel asked one day over the phone. "Why?" I replied, not out of malice but caution. Her voice wavered. I want to talk. About everything. I need to explain." I agreed, but only out of curiosity. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, where she fidgeted nervously with her coffee cup. "I was wrong," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About Mom, about Blake, about you." I said nothing, letting her continue. "Mom told us you didn't care about us," Hazel admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "She made it seem like you were too busy for our family, like Blake was the one holding us together." I believed her because, I don't know, it was easier to believe her. Her words stung, but I nodded. "And now I see what she really is," Hazel said, her voice firming. "And what Blake is. I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know how I let it get this far." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Hazel, I appreciate your apology. But trust isn't something that can be fixed overnight. You and your sister took their side without ever asking me for the truth. Do you know how much that hurt?" She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I want a chance to make things right." Kayla's reconciliation came later and was far less emotional. She showed up unannounced in my office one evening, looking awkward and out of place in the sleek, professional environment. "Can we talk?" she asked hesitantly. "Make it quick," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. She took a deep breath. "I've been an idiot. I let Mom and Blake manipulate me into thinking you were the enemy when you were just working hard to give us a good life. I didn't appreciate that. I didn't appreciate you." Her words were honest, but lacked the emotional weight of Hazel's apology. Still, I listened. "Why now?" I asked, my tone neutral. "Because I see it now," she said, fidgeting with her bracelet. "Mom and Blake aren't victims. They're users. And you didn't deserve what we put you through." I nodded, letting her finish. Rebuilding my relationship with my daughters was a slow process. I didn't shut them out entirely, but I made it clear that trust had to be earned. We started with small things, occasional lunches, phone calls, and shared memories that reminded us of the bond we once had. As for Grace and Blake, their lives continued to spiral. They moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, far from the sprawling home they had once stolen from me. Grace tried to reach out again, showing up at my office unannounced one day. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaking. "Please. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Blake, he used me. I need your help." I stared at her, unmoved. "You made your bed, Grace. Now lie in it." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't waver. She had destroyed everything we'd built together, and I had no intention of letting her back into my life. Blake, too, made a final attempt to appeal to me. He called me one evening, his voice hollow and desperate. "Daniel, I need a loan," he said bluntly. "Just enough to get back on my feet." I couldn't help but laugh. "You must be joking." "I'm serious," he said, his tone pleading. "I've got nothing left, man. I'll pay you back, I swear." "You've already taken enough from me," I replied coldly. "Don't call this number again." By the end of it all, Grace and Blake were left with nothing but each other. Their relationship, built on lies and betrayal, crumbled under the weight of their failures. Meanwhile, I moved forward, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever the future held. Grace and Blake had thought they could destroy me, but in the end, they only destroyed themselves. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold. I stood on the balcony of my new home, a modest but elegant house overlooking the coastline. The waves rolled in rhythmically, their gentle crash against the rocks below matching the steadiness of my breathing. Amina stood beside me, her fingers intertwined with mine, her warmth grounding me in the present. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft, as if she didn't want to disturb the peace. "It is," I replied, glancing at her. But it wasn't the ocean I was looking at. It was her. She caught me staring and smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. You're supposed to be admiring the sunset, not me. I shrugged. Hard to choose. She laughed, a light, musical sound that always managed to pull me from my thoughts. Amina had come into my life when I'd been at my lowest, but instead of fixing me, she simply reminded me that I had the strength to rebuild myself. It had been over a year since the chaos with Grace and Blake finally ended. Their fall had been spectacular, and I'd watched it from a distance, determined not to let their misery consume me. Grace had reached out a few more times, each attempt more desperate than the last. One evening, I'd received another email from her. The subject line simply read, "Please." I hesitated before opening it. "Daniel, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to ask for it. But I'm lost. Blake and I are over. He left me when the money ran out. The girls are distant, and I'm all alone. I don't know how to move forward. Please, just a chance to talk." I stared at the screen, her words blurring together. Grace had always been good with words, but I knew they were empty. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry for where it had led her. I closed the email without responding. Blake's end was no less satisfying. The last I'd heard, he was living in a small apartment across town, working odd jobs to scrape by. He'd reached out once as well, leaving a voicemail I had no intention of returning. "Daniel," his voice rasped, full of defeat. "I know I messed up. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need help. I'm drowning here. Just, if there's any part of you that still sees me as the friend I used to be, call me back." I deleted the message without hesitation. Blake had been a friend once, but he'd made his choices, and he'd have to live with them. My daughters, Kayla and Hazel, were a different story. Rebuilding my relationship with them had been slow and painful, but it was worth it. Kayla had been the first to truly reach out. One weekend, she showed up at my door, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. We sat in the living room, the wine untouched between us. "I was wrong," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "About Mom, about Blake, about everything. I don't even know how to begin apologizing." "Start by telling me why," I said. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Mom made us believe you didn't care, that you were too focused on work to notice us, to love us. And Blake, he was always there, acting like the dad we thought you weren't." Her words stung, but I nodded. "And now I see the truth," she said, meeting my gaze. "Mom used us, just like she used you. And Blake, he's nothing but a fraud." We talked for hours, unpacking years of misunderstandings and pain. By the end of it, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Hazel's journey back to me was slower, but eventually, she too came around. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Trust, as I told them both, had to be earned. Amina's hand squeezed mine, pulling me back to the present. "You're thinking about them again, aren't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I nodded. "Sometimes it's hard not to. They were such a big part of my life. But it doesn't hurt like it used to." Amina smiled. "That's progress." I turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've been my anchor through all of this, you know that?" She laughed softly. "You give me too much credit. You've done the hard work yourself." "Maybe," I said, pulling her closer. "But I couldn't have done it without you." We stood in silence for a while, the sound of the waves filling the air. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. Later that evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Amina leaned her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. "All the time," I said. And I smiled. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm chasing something or running from something. I'm just here, and that's enough. She tilted her head to look at me. "You're allowed to dream, you know. To want more?" I nodded. "I know, and maybe I will. But right now, this is all I need." As the fire crackled and the evening stretched on, I thought about how far I'd come. Grace and Blake had tried to destroy me, but in doing so, they'd given me something invaluable: freedom. Freedom to rebuild my life. Freedom to find love again. Freedom to be happy. And for the first time, I was truly happy.